Yeah, everyone, welcome to How to Get Yourself Published, and I'm glad that I'm not doing this on my own. Otherwise, it would be a long hour and a half. But yeah, let's talk about getting published versus the post-contract process, because there's a difference between getting yourself published and details that come with what happens after you sign the contract.
Hmm. Yeah.
So, what is everyone's thoughts about it?
Well, I mean, my advice to people asking how to get published is usually it's a very simple process. You write a story, make it the best you can, send it to a publisher who's looking for that kind of story. If it gets accepted, great. If not, go back to step two and repeat.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, it's that
Delicious.
simple.
I tried
much over-
self-publishing at first.
how
If
did
I could
that
say
go?
one word to summarize this, it would be patience.
A lot of patience.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
true. How many times did J.K. Rowling get rejected before she got published?
I think it was like 12 times or 12 publishing houses that said no to the original Sorcerer's Stone manuscript.
And yeah, she hung them in her office from now on, until she eventually got accepted. She hung the
Stephen
rejection
King
letters,
had
I
a
mean.
spike. He would just take all his rejections and put them on the spike until eventually the spike fell off the wall, I believe.
Stephen King's first novel, Carrie, didn't actually technically get sent in by him. He was very dejected over it, over the results he was getting, and he's found one more publishing house that he was convinced would reject it, and so he didn't send it in. But his wife secretly sent the manuscript in to them, and they loved it and got him published.
Man, I wish it were that easy these days.
But yeah, it just took one more for him to become the famous author we all know today.
But yeah, each of those steps has a lot of things around it. Like there used to be, and I don't know if there still is, but there used to be a belief among authors starting out that they just needed to write the story, and the editor was the person who edits the story and makes it better. And so back when I was editing, we would get stories with typos, we would get stories with grammar problems, and like you especially if you're not a known author, if nobody knows what you can do, you need to make your story the most polished and finished that you can make it before you send it on to someone else. The editor's job at that point is simply to decide whether or not they want to publish your story. It's not to make it a better story.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like the author can just think of a story and let the editors and everyone else do all of the hard work for them. It's not like it's not like fifth grade me can write a great novel and expect them to take care of all the edits, the grammar, and everything else. You do have to put your own sweat into the process as well.
If you put your shoes in put your feet in the shoes of the editor, you'll notice that. Just think about it. If someone gives you something to read, do you really want to be stumbling over typos and trying to figure out what's going on? It's going to make it a lot harder for them to, let alone read your story, let alone decide if it's good enough to be published when they're struggling to get through it. So, reaching back to what Kyle said there, it's like you really should be giving them as polished as you can. Eventually, if you start to get a repetition or a reputation, then there can be a little leeway between you and probably an editor you've worked with for a while. But I know, talking with some of the publishers, many of them people will go like, "Hey, can I submit you? I'm still working on this," and that's usually a bad sign.
Yeah. my publisher had this philosophy where she would read a story. She would read a story or novel, and if it did not impress her within the first page or even the first paragraph, she would immediately reject it.
Oh yeah, that's definitely it. I did slush power reading for Diabolical Plots, and yeah, that's when you receive so many submissions, you really do need something that stands out or something that's like, wow, I can't put this down. So if it's taking you like 5, 6 pages to kind of really pull the reader into your story, then there's a high probability you're going to get rejected.
I don't make a. Sorry, I don't. I just wanted to comment. I don't make a good slush pile reader because I have kind of an obsession with finishing the story. Because even if the first 2 pages are terrible, I keep thinking, like, maybe there's something at the end. Maybe it gets a little better at the end, and I can't. It's very, very hard for me to just toss it out. So that is not a good trait to have for a slush pile reader. Slush pile readers have to be able to pass judgment quickly and move on.
Yeah, definitely. So, first, one thing to consider when getting yourself published is that above all else, you need to know what you're trying to market to your audience or what you can identify the novel as. You can't exactly say it's like 8 different genres all at once.
True, and it's hard. It's helpful. Sorry, it's helpful sometimes if you can come up with what people call comps or comparable works. So if you say, my story is like a furry Harry Potter meets Die Hard, then like that at least gives the publisher an idea of what kind of story you're writing. I have no idea what that would look like. I just grabbed 2 names of things that popped into my head. But
Harry Potter meets Die Hard. That I really want to read.
Quick, Ocean, write it.
Will you please write that, Kyle?
I might have to now.
Yippee-ki-yay, mother. That would be a wonderful thing. Sorry, now I have that stuck in my head.
But yeah, anyway, if a lot of people find it hard to boil down their novel, if you're submitting a short story, you don't really have to do this as much because you're submitting it hopefully to a market, and so you just have to say, hey, you're writing an anthology about horror themed to outer space, and I'm sending you an outer space horror story here. But if you're pitching a novel, then it helps to be able to summarize it in a couple sentences, and then to maybe give the editor comps to help them kind of place what sort of thing you are giving them.
Yeah, definitely. To piggyback off of what Kyle said, I was reading this book, and basically the author was saying it's like you need to have an elevator pitch in which, like, basically imagine if you met the publisher of your dreams on an elevator, and they're like, okay, you're like, yeah, I have a great story, and they're like, okay, you've got 30 seconds to pitch me your story. In those 30 seconds, you need to tell me who, what, where, when, how, and why I should care about your story. If you can do that, usually that gives the editor an edge, and it'll make them read your story. Because now, to be fair, I have seen some people who sent in like some pitches that have been kind of like, I don't know, but they've written great stories. So it's not the end all be all if you can't write a great pitch, but it does go a long way in helping the editor like spark some interest if you're submitting for like a novel.
To piggyback off what you said, that is definitely true. And one thing I would recommend is that if you know what your novel is about, you should basically break it down into 2 or 3 different genres or subgenres to describe it. Like, for example, my debut novel is The Adventures of Peter Gray, and it's the best way I can describe it is as a historical coming-of-age fantasy that is basically Oliver Twist meets Zootopia. And if you can manage to condense it down into that, you can definitely use it as a pitch to focus more on the other who, what, when, where, why aspects to that publisher to get them to know why they should focus on getting your book out there.
Just as a check, did we go dead or something?
Yeah, I was wondering for a second, did everyone just go silent, or?
I don't know that I have a lot more to say on this topic.
All right, I can go to
did
the
you
next
wanna-
panel if you want,
Sure.
or to the next slide. All right. Basically, don't hold back on your writing or marketing. Let everyone know what you're doing, and definitely show that you are a writer that wants to be taken seriously. And that if you want to have your published works out there, you need to be serious about it. You can't just be offhanded about it and assume that you'll be published just by saying you want to be published.
So what I'm what I'm hearing from that is basically, like, in terms of concrete actions, you need to actually send your stories to publishers. You need to put your writing out there. I recommend having a page on some gallery site, whether it's So Furry or For Affinity or one of the other ones, and posting at least some of your writing there, because that helps you get feedback from the community. But that also provides a place where if you send a novel to a publisher, for example, they may want to know more about you, and then you can point them to, oh, here's my page, and there's a lot of other stuff I've written on this page. It at least gives you a profile and a presence in the community, which in furry publishing is important.
Yeah, I've heard of the story where an author was asked by a reader that they want to become a writer, but they're afraid of posting it online, some of their works online, because they don't want their story to be ripped off or stolen. But the author replied that if he's going to write, it should be something worth stealing. Or if he's gonna
So for Fangs and Fonts, we tested this. We basically picked a prompt. We tried to have some very specific details, and the four of us all tried to write the same story. And if you go back and check that episode, which probably still needs to be re-uploaded, you'll find out that we had four very different stories.
Really?
Yes. Like, because we hear that a lot. A lot of people have come out and said, "Well, I don't want to send it out to beta readers, or I don't want to tell other people. I don't want to have other people read it and give me feedback because they might steal my idea." And the thing
Yeah,
is,
I've gotten
if
tired of
you're
that.
able to write your story confidently enough, if you're good enough and you know how to write, it's gonna be very hard for someone to A, rip off your idea, and B, rip it off and do it better than you. Like, it's kind of a silly conspiracy thing, really, than what actually happens.
Yeah, I never believed in that. Yeah, if you're
So
going
I'm
to
trying to.
technically, even if you publish, that conspiracy still doesn't hold water, even if it is a conspiracy.
Oh
I
yeah.
mean, there's this idea out there
Yeah.
that there are like 5 different kinds of stories, and that does have some truth to it, but not every. But your story is still your story, and if you want everyone to read it, then you should get everyone to read it.
Hmm. Yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely with the story stealing thing. Like having like I follow a lot of the literary magazine editors and just kind of get some guidelines and stuff from them. And they have had people who've tried to submit entire other books in the slush pile, and they've caught themselves, and they've caught them, and it's quite hilarious when they do, because at that point the person is pretty much banned from ever submitting to their publications ever again. But it's always hilarious to see them talk about it on Twitter.
Oh wow.
It's also worth noting to that point that publishers talk to each other, and we always want to mention this in these panels. That of course, the overriding thing in every step of this process is don't be a jerk. Don't feel like there. And we wouldn't tell these stories if these things didn't happen. Don't write back to a rejection telling the editor that they can't possibly have read your story correctly. Don't tweet your rejection and talk about how terrible the editor or publication is because they didn't take your story.
That reminds me of this one story I've heard from a publisher. Someone emailed him about a rejection, and I kid you not, the email was entirely in rhyme.
Wow.
It basically summed up to, I wish you well, but I seriously hope that you burn in hell. That was pretty much the email in a nutshell, and they pretty much got blocked right away.
I mean, we've had people try to do this within the fandom, and of course, as Kyle said, we do talk to each other. I'm quite happy talking with the other editors, and because I read so much, I do know when people are saying like, "Well, Casey is like a terrible author, and she rejected my stuff, but I know you're a better person, so I'll know." And usually, it ends up in my Telegram a few minutes later. So yeah, don't blacklist yourself by doing that.
If I can add on to Kyle's list, don't tell the publisher that you've got a different publisher who wants to sell this when you don't.
You're pretty much inviting yourself to be blacklisted there.
The worst I've gotten so far was a watermarked PDF when I specifically requested a doc because you needed to copy-paste these stories for an anthology, don't you?
Yeah, if you give editors a good story to tell other editors about what a jerk you are, then they're going to do that. And I can I have a similar story to your watermarked PDF. We had somebody come up to Soful's table, and our submission guidelines were: we accept stories for these markets when they're open. I forget if we were looking at novels at that point. And we take electronic submissions in Word or plain text or something anyway. So this person walks up to our table, hands us a thumb drive with a 40,000 word submission on it, which was not a length that we were taking submissions for. That was in WordPerfect format.
What?
Really?
And
you're serious?
I tried to tell them, you need to do this electronically, and they were like, "Look, well, it's here, just take it." And I'm like, "We're fine, but we're probably not going to be able to look at it for a while because this isn't in our." And they were like, "It's fine, whatever. Here, I've given you the stories now." And it was just a great, a great combination of the wrong format, the wrong length, and and everything. So,
I see Fuzz says they did the same thing to For Planet.
Oh wow!
Perhaps this is a good time right now to just cut in and go, "Hey, it's great to approach publishers at conventions, but when they're trying to sell books, that is not the greatest time to bug them."
Right?
Definitely not.
It's okay to approach them at conventions with a quick question like, "Hey, when is Roar going to be open for submissions again?" Or, hey, are you guys going to be open for novel submissions anytime soon? Or, hey, I emailed you about this thing and I want to just real quick follow up on it. But don't like go up to people trying to sell books and engage them in a long discussion about anything other than buying their books.
Yeah, definitely don't do that because otherwise you're pretty much making yourself look like a jackass there.
Well, they're there to sell books. That's their main thing to do right at that point, and you're kind of holding them back. And like Kyle said, they're fine to answer quick questions and that. But if you want to do a lengthy question, it's possible to like, hey, do you have time later after the dealer's den is closed, and I could talk to you about something?
Yes.
Yeah, that. Sorry, my dog's having a barking section upstairs. She's more of an alarm dog than a guard dog, so.
Yeah. Yeah, we've got a Chihuahua Terrier mix.
Ours used to bark at noises outside, and now he mostly barks when he thinks he's supposed to be getting food and isn't.
Same here, though my dog's a Chihuahua Wiener Dog hybrid, and so she thinks she's the largest dog there is. So.
Oh, God.
Anyway, we're getting a bit off topic. Should I go to the next slide?
Sure.
Yeah,
I mean, we're mostly here to support you, so why don't you keep going as you see fit, and we will chime in as you can ask us to chime in, or we've been just kind of chiming in. But I would say you go ahead and guide the panel the way that you want to, and we will follow along.
All right, if you insist. Next is about literary agents and networking, because both are equally important. You can't exactly, if you're a good writer, chances are you might be a good marketer, but it's best to talk to someone who absolutely knows what is popular out there right now. And what's everyone else's thoughts on it?
So there aren't too many literary agents in the furry scene. I think Sean of Gold Publishing was trying it for a bit. But I don't know if it panned out. But networking, on the other hand, is fantastic, and I would encourage anyone. I assume most people who are watching this already know of the Furry Writers Guild, and just following a bunch of writers and publishers and editors on Twitter and just kind of saying hey and asking questions and helping out other people just builds up that community and helps you and everyone else around you grow and improve.
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing I would recommend when networking is that understand that they are people too. They won't that they aren't exactly like a goal or a means to an end. It is good to network, but there's a difference between networking and being a bit callous in your approach or like self-important in your approach. If you get what I'm going at, right? Like I've met people who I've met people who network but don't do it the right way. They just assume that they just assume that it's that connecting with other people is a goal rather than important to meet other people and make friends within the community you're trying to introduce yourself to.
Yeah, there's definitely there's definitely a way to do it and a way not to, and you can make it clear that you're a writer and part of the writing community, and you want to talk writing and publishing with someone without also making it very painfully clear that the only reason you want to talk to them is to get them to publish one of your stories.
Yeah, that is definitely a thing to consider. Otherwise, you're, like you said, like we've been saying, that publishers talk, and if you aren't good at networking, definitely affect how you try to approach a publisher and ask if they want to look at your works. Like, Kyle, remember that story of you said about with the flash drive? That's a bad example of networking.
Well, that wasn't even an example of networking because they just walked up to us, gave us the flash drive, insisted we take it, and then walked away. Like, they didn't try to start a conversation or anything.
They didn't even introduce themselves or who they were.
Right. I mean,
Really?
we knew who they were. We knew who they were. We'd met them before.
Okay.
But it wasn't like they weren't trying to become friends and then like handed us the flash drive. I've had people, I get people emailing me because of the things that I've written, and a lot of times they just email me and say, "Oh, thanks for your story," and then I want to tell you this thing, and sometimes we start a conversation and it goes well. But a couple times people will email me and be like, "Hey, I just wanted to say, like, I think your writing's really cool and stuff," and then I respond with a thanks, and then they respond with, "Hey, I have a story and I was wondering if you could read it and just like give me feedback on it, or I wonder if you could like help me get this, tell me what this story is." And then I always respond and say, "I can't read your story," and then I never hear from them again.
Oh.
Oh yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Like, yeah, with that, it really hurts when I have to do that to people because like I really do enjoy reading all the stories that people want me to read, or they think that I have some kind of knowledge to impart on them that would help them get published or something. But a lot of times we just do not have the time to read everyone's story and provide the individual feedback and critiques that everyone's looking for. But I mean, if I do have the time, I will gladly spark up a conversation with you on writing and publishing and reading books, especially on books. I can talk for hours on books, but there, like others have said, there's always a time and place to approach like editors and the publishers and even other writers about trying to pitch your story. And also, like, don't like Domina said, don't try to use this because, of course, we can tell when it's like, okay, I just want to be your friend because I want you to publish my stuff and you'll never hear from me again. It's like,
Right,
no,
that kind of hurts when that happens.
yeah, it's like, be genuine. Like, we're still people too. We have feelings, you know?
If you go back to what we were saying about not beta readers, with slush pile, there's a reason that the good slush pile people are able to just go 2 pages and we're done, 2 pages and we're done. Reading a whole person's story takes a lot of time, and then you have to also take the time to formulate critique in that to return it to them. So if you want to ask questions of people that they can usually answer pretty quickly, that's usually pretty fine. As soon as you're like, "Hey, can you read my novel and get back to me?" That's a little too far.
Yeah. Yeah, they assume that we have all the time in the world.
Yeah, and I don't mind if people say, "Hey, I'm stuck at this point in my story. Do you have any tips to help?" But as soon as they go like, "Oh, can you read my story?" then I'm like, "Well, now that's a commitment. Like I have to, as and this, it's for sure not just us. John Scalzi also wrote a thing because he gets requests from people also who want him to read their stuff, and so he said, "This is kind of like, would you go up to a lawyer friend and say, 'Hey, I'm being sued. If you have the time, could you just come defend me in court one day?'"
Oh my god!
Like, this is my
Not
job.
after reading Boozy's Twitter, I wouldn't.
This is my job, and so you're basically asking me to do my job for free as a favor, and because you're asking it as a favor, like, first of all, I'm probably going to say no, but then you can't get upset at me because you're asking me for a favor, and I'm not obliged to do that favor to you. Anyway, this is getting a little off topic also, but the point is, don't make it. Do not go up to someone with only the goal of using them to network to get yourself published, and because they can always tell, and then they will not do the thing that you want them to do.
Absolutely, Kyle. That is definitely to consider because as much as people want to believe, even the greatest writers are still human. They still have lives of their own. They have their personal life. They have family, friends, loved ones, and they have other commitments. And it's unlikely that And unless you're a really, really close friend of theirs, they're not gonna drop all of that just to read it, just to read an entire novel. They'll definitely give you tips. We can definitely give tips, but we're not going to be like an omniscient god that can do almost everything. We can definitely help them out, but they need to be understanding and genuine in the process of it. And back to literary agents, there aren't any in the fan. There aren't that much in the fandom, but it's always good to get an opinion from someone who knows what the best novels out there are, or when the best time will be to get a novel published.
Right. And agents, just real quick on that, agents are very much like editors in that they get a ton of queries every day. So they're probably not going to be able to personally respond to your query. They may not even respond at all. In many of the queries that I sent out, just never got responses. There are lots of resources on the internet about how to write a good query to an agent, and I recommend that you use them, because if you don't write a good query letter, then that's a good way for them to tell that you're not someone that they want to do business with.
But yeah, here's a good question. I have a question on the chat. On this slide, does anyone in the fandom beside Ursula Vernon actually have a literary agent? I don't have one, though I talked to my mother, who is a lawyer. She knows much about reading contracts and the implications of what to do in a publishing situation.
Jess E. Owen got a literary agent for her non-furry YA novel recently. She tweeted about that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, congrats, Jess. That was a big thing on Twitter.
It's awesome.
But yeah, I can go to the next slide then. Oh yeah, this is definitely a plus. Prepare your manuscript and make sure there are little to no grammar issues. Otherwise, it'll definitely get rejected. Especially if you're unprepared for it.
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit earlier, and I think something Ocean was talking about with beta readers. This is where it's important to have a community to help you out, because having other people read your manuscript before you send it off to a publisher or an agent is really important, because they will catch things that you didn't see.
One thing you can... Oh, sorry to interrupt.
No. I was just going to say, you write your book with a lot of assumptions about what you know and word construction that you're familiar with, and different sets of eyes will see things differently and will help you fix a lot of these problems that you may not be aware of.
Yeah, definitely what you said, though. Going off that, you should definitely try to get more than like a beta reader to read it. You should also get someone who knows how to edit, because beta readers can sometimes be more like, how do I describe this? Beta reading is sometimes more focused on the plot than it is on like how it actually works, or whether or not it's a great story in the end. They're more focused on like the emotion rather than the practicality of it, of whether or not it can sell well.
Do you mean like proofreading?
Yeah, a bit like proofreading, but also whether or not it's a good story or if there are any plot holes.
For myself, when I do a beta read, if someone asks me to do a beta read, I'm going to tell them if there's plot holes, or if I feel their characters, generally I try to tell them how I felt about reading the book, and not to tell them what I think their book should be.
Yeah.
If I have issues with the plot, I'm going to explain my issues. I'm going to tell them the things I liked and disliked, and they can take that and do what they want. But if they want me to, and I usually ask this, I'm like, do you also want me to do proofreading? Because that's where I'm going to actually start like correcting your periods and whatnot, because that's going to take a heck of a lot more time. And B, if they're going to be rewriting chunks of this, then the proofreading doesn't matter as much, because they're going to be rewriting it. So, but that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, that is a good point there, because there are different levels of beta reading that there are out there, and you have to have a beta reader that knows that all the different intricacies of it. That the story has to have good grammar, it has to make sense, it has to have a good plot, and it has to keep their attention overall. Though when it comes to the manuscript, there are some requirements for publishing companies that have that they say they must have in order for them to accept the manuscript. Like it has to be done in a certain document. It has to have certain elements in it, like a prologue or that kind of thing. You get what I'm going at here?
Oh yeah, definitely. When you get into that level of it, usually you have, if you're building up a novel and stuff, you usually have a team of beta readers. You don't just have like one or two people that you go to, because what you're looking for may not necessarily be their strength, and you don't want to do what I call falling into the cracks, because you have a blind spot to something, and because your beta readers are like your friends, they also have a blind spot to it, and you send this out, and if you're lucky enough to make it past like even an editor and get to being published, your readers pick it up and they're like, okay, this person has a blind spot, they didn't do their research, or this is a serious plot problem, like I don't like how character A and character B are just conveniently together. This is something a beta reader should have picked up.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone have any other thoughts?
I did want to add a point that when you're preparing your manuscript, please read the instructions for submission from the publisher. And the same with Kyle's example, a guy just comes up and goes, "Here's my document," and it's not even in a good format. Generally, if they don't have what kind of format they want, you'll want to look up the standard formatting. There's many resources on what it is, and it's not too hard to follow. As well, it's really not too hard to double and triple check what they want you to do with your submission. They'll say how they want it presented, how they want it emailed or sent to them, what they want in the prologue, or what they want sent to them. And as someone who's done enough slush piles, I can tell you that no one ever 100% follows this. There's always something that many people forget or do wrong. And it's something very silly that can get you denied into publishing because you didn't read an instruction.
And yeah, make sure that they're accepting works of the length that you're sending. Make sure that they're accepting the kind of work, the genre that you're submitting. Make sure they're actually open for submissions, and make sure that you follow all of the guidelines about how to send it. Like if they some agents, for example, will say, don't send anything as an attachment, paste it all into the body of the email, because probably they're worried about getting viruses from attachments or something. But others will say, send it as an attachment to the letter, because we want to save all the attachments in a separate place and look at them separately. And so figure that out, read it carefully, because this publisher-writer agreement is also a business relationship, and they want to know not just can you write good stories, but how are you at being part of a business relationship and being able to follow instructions and be prompt and on time as much as is possible as a writer, are good qualities for someone in a business relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good to show. It's definitely good in showing how serious you want to be taken as a writer. Otherwise, if you can't meet the expectations of the publishing company, it proves to them that they might not want to invest in getting your novel out there, because otherwise it won't. It'll make them wonder whether or not it will be a good investment. Sorry, I ran around there.
It's definitely a good point there, Kyle, because it's almost like a job interview. When you're in the interview, they generally already know you have the skills they want. They also want to know if you're going to fit with the team. And so by following directions and having good communication and even reaching out to them with questions, if anything isn't sure, that usually is a good sign versus someone that just dumps it on their desk and goes, here you go.
Yeah, that is a good comparison there, a job interview, because you have to show your best self in order to get what you're trying to get. Otherwise, it might backfire on you, and you'll end up repeating the same mistakes over and over.
And I know we've said things about like publishers talk to each other and you can get a reputation and whatnot. I think honestly, if you just send in a manuscript in the wrong format or something, you'll probably just get a letter back saying, hey, can you please just resubmit this in the right format? We're not going to talk to each other and be like, hey, can you guys imagine this guy sent in his novel in open office format instead of Microsoft Word? Like, let's never publish them again.
Yeah, that's kind of
yeah, at most we'll just kind of joke about, hey, someone sent me their manuscript in latex, and we'll be like, what? Yeah. And that'll be it.
They sent it to me. Hey, they sent me their manuscript on the bark of a tree.
But it's not. If you just make a little mistake, it's usually not a critical one. But like, just don't make those mistakes.
Yeah, you do have to know what the publishing company wants from you in order for you to actually be able to go on to the next step. Otherwise, it's
which is this one, right? You moved the slide forward while we were.
I moved it a bit forward because we were talking about publishing companies, and I thought this fit right into it. Actually,
yes. There are. It's always changing, but I think there's at least half a dozen publishing companies in the furry fandom. Probably a few more, and you can find information about them in the Furry Writers Guild, as Ocean mentioned earlier.
I think if we wanted to just kind of blanket what we're saying is put forward your best work, follow directions, and double check it, but also don't stress too much about it. And I'm not sure if you've got a slide on this, but be prepared for rejection regardless.
Yeah, I don't want. What we're saying is like, go through all the steps, make sure you're doing the best that you can, but don't become paralyzed with the fear that you're making some little mistake so that you don't send anything in at all. Like, you have to send the thing in, do the work, get someone to look it over for you, and then just do it. Don't become so paralyzed that you're like, oh, it's better, I'll just like post it on my website. It's better that I don't send it to a publisher in case I screw up and they all hate me forever.
Yeah, that is a good point there, Kyle. I'll go to the next slide then. Definitely prepare for compromises, because that's the best way to describe the relationship of a publisher and a writer, and it's making a compromise of what you can put in the novel and in the final product.
Oh my gosh.
Yep, but that doesn't mean don't fight. That doesn't mean don't be prepared to stand up for what you think should stay in the final product, though.
Yeah, go ahead, Karen. Sorry.
With being ready to kind of fight for your novel, how can I say this? Like, understand where you want your novel to go and things that you want to have in your novel, but also don't sweat the small stuff. And please always understand that if you manage to land a story with an editor, they're working for you and not against you. So if they tell you that something in a story is not working, rather than trying to be argumentative and being aggressive and think that it's a personal slight on you, try to reflect on it and think like, hey, maybe I should try what they say and see what happens and see how this works out and see where my brain goes, instead of just taking it as, oh, this editor doesn't know what they're talking about, they're trying to ruin my work, or they're trying to write my story for me.
Yeah, most of these changes usually revolve around like small elements, like names or the plot or on something like, for example, in The Adventures of Peter Gray, when I first started working with my publisher, she wanted to change the name of one side character to a different one because their name sounded similar to one of the main characters, and it would confuse some readers as to which one I'm talking about.
Yeah, and I think what Kiri said is a great point that I was going to also say. So building on that, like, the editor is trying to make your story better, and if they are offering suggestions that you feel don't do that, then the way to address that is to take a step back and say, okay, here is how I envisioned this novel. Here is what I wanted this novel to do, and it feels like the things that you're suggesting are moving it away from that. So, like, are we on the same page about this? And have a discussion about it. And it is a back and forth all the time. It's going to be. I've definitely had that situation where someone wrote back and said, "Hey, I suggest this edit. Like, I suggest that you cut this part." And my initial, like, reflexive reaction was, "How dare!" And then I was like, "Well, no, wait. Like, just play out the what if. You're not committing to anything. But what if I did cut that part?" And then I played it out in my head, and I was like, "Oh, it would change that, and then I could put that there, and then yeah, that would work." And so I've had that initial, like, I would never. And then when I stepped back and thought about it, like, oh, that's actually a good idea. I should do that.
Yeah, that is a good point there, because when you think about it, we always think of our works as like, I hate to be cliched here, but we always think of our works as our children, and that it can't be changed or anything. But um, they but the first draft is always flawed, and it does need to be polished and retooled. And we're sometimes not that much open to changing it a bit, but it has to be done either way. Did I go silent here, or?
I don't know that I have much more on this. Just, like, understand that an editor didn't buy your book so that they could sabotage it. Like, they're now invested in it as well.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'll head to the next slide then. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, my book cover is supposed to be here, but yeah, this is a section that I thought I was going to ask everyone else, but I wanted to ask everyone else, but how did everyone here get published in the first place? Like, how did your first novel work get published, and what was the process behind it? Shall I go first, or does anyone else want to go first?
Yeah, you started stuff.
You go
Yeah,
first.
sure.
All right, it's actually an interesting story because I was in high school and my youngest brother was in show choir, and so we were dragged to. So I was dragged a lot with it with my mom, and she became friends with this woman who would end up becoming my future publisher. And back then, I was still writing short stories and wanted to become a better writer. And then my mom met Brittany, and she asked her if she could read some of my stories and see what her thoughts were on it. We met for coffee, and she read one of my short stories, and she said that she was blunt with me and said that based on the first paragraph she read, she would not publish it if it were a novel. And yeah, that kind of crushed me at first, but I took her words to heart, and eventually started improving some of my writing style. I started relying less and less on cliches. I started trying to make it more interesting, and I started doing a bit of writing experiments. One of which involved me writing like a small short story every 2 weeks for an entire year. From 2014 to 2015, I wrote one small short story every year that was a connected story, and that would eventually become the manuscript that was The Adventures of Peter Gray. And after I finished it all, I didn't know what to do with it. I continued editing it, but I and even sent it to a couple publishing companies, but it ended up getting rejected. So I thought back to Brittany, and I sent her an email asking if what she would think about this idea for a novel, and I sent her the basic plot of it. She was intrigued, and I sent and asked if she could read like a chapter of it. I did, and she immediately asked if she could publish it under her company. She went from hating my writing style to immediately asking if she could publish my novel and get my name out there.
That's cool.
Nice.
Yeah, and it was especially great because until then I didn't have that much confidence in my writing, and it was basically a big boost in morale for me and made myself more confident and knowing that I can write good stories that can be worthy of publishing, and yeah, it eventually led me to actually joining the Furry Writers Guild in the first place.
Cool. That's that's an unusual path, but it worked. So awesome. I'm happy to go next if no one else wants to jump in.
Sure. Or anyone else?
I'll go after Kyle.
I suppose I could go after you.
All right. I'm trying to think of what my first published novel was. So I guess it was Vol. So in the late 90s, I was posting this fantasy story on some news group whose name I've already forgotten. And it attracted the attention of Jeff Eddy, who goes by Brer in the fandom. And he and I started talking about writing and stuff. He wanted to start a publishing company in the furry fandom, and I offered to help with that. And so in '99, we started Sofa Wolf Press with a magazine called Anthrelations. And I had mostly been writing short stories to that point, but the thing that I'd posted in the late 90s was a novel, and I never finished it. But as I wrote more things, I felt the urge to write a novel again. So I wrote this novel, and I handed it to Brer and said, "Do you feel like this is something that Sofa Wolf would want to publish?" And so he read it, and his partner read it, and they both agreed to publish it. And so that's how I got my first novel published. So there you go. Just start a publishing company and have a really smart and discerning editor as your partner, and then write a novel. It's that easy.
I've got one of those down. But my story is kind of a different route. Let's see. Back when I first started getting involved with furry and stuff and meeting up with my local furry group, I actually met Night Eyes because he was local to me. And of course, he told me about how he wrote, and I was like, "Oh, okay, that's pretty cool." I was like, "Well, since you write and stuff, I'll support you." And he was like, well, and I was like, okay. So I went to my first FurryCon, which was FWA. So we get there, and I see on one of their rare occasions Fur Planet's there, and Fuzz, even though I didn't know his name at the time, is working behind the table. And I'm, of course, in like my element. There are like all these furry books around, and I'm like, yay, books. So I pick it up, and I managed to pick up the 2 that Nades was in. So, of course, I was going to go have him sign them. But then I started talking with Fuzz, and he's like, yeah. And long story short, which is the forward to Claw, he's telling me about publishing stories and stuff. And I was like, yeah, I may want to get into that someday. I may want to end up writing or something. And then later on, the call comes out for Fur to Skin, Ladies' Night, and then, of course, Inhuman Acts. Hi, Fuzz! And I was like, well, I wanted to try my hand at writing because, like, there are these genres I had never written in before, which were erotica and noir. Now I can tell you what noir is, but back then I kind of didn't know, so I basically used a lot of tropes, and I had to rely on some of my friends to look over my story and tell me what's going on, and of course, brace me for trouble. Like, Nades definitely was like, okay, Curie, if you don't get picked in, it's, just understand not everybody gets in on their first submission, He's kind of being like really big brotherly and giving me the talk, like, it's going to be okay if you don't get in. So I ended up submitting my story to both of those. And I hear back from Ocean, and he's like, okay, I'd like to accept your story, but there are a couple of things I need you to change. And I'm resolute. I'm like, no, I don't want to change these. But we go through, and as a matter of fact, we strike up a really good conversation, and he really shows me, like Ocean really showed me how to fix my story and get it on the path that I wanted it to go. Because, like, a really good editor will see the path that you want to go on, and they're going to guide your writing to go down that path and achieve the goal that you want. And here I am, like, all these years later, editing and still writing when I can. And, of course, living with my editor.
I think it's important to note that last part doesn't always happen.
No.
Please don't get into a relationship so you can have an editor.
No, that would be... So I've noticed that most of the time when someone is trying to get published, it often works when they know who the publisher is. It helps them not just on a professional level, but a personal level, and that can either be a good thing or a bad thing.
Well, in the furry fandom, it's a small and active community, and
yeah, that is right.
And especially if you're talking about a novel is such a big endeavor that very rarely, although it's starting to happen now, but rarely does someone just come out of nowhere with a novel and say, "Hey, I wrote this novel," and we've never heard of them before. Like, usually someone will have been at least in the Furry Writers Guild and talking to people, or they'll have posted short stories, or they'll have had short stories published somewhere, and then they come out with a novel, and you're like, great, a novel. But occasionally you get people who just sort of come out of nowhere with a novel. But yeah, if you're active in the community and people know who you are, then that doesn't mean your novel's more likely to get published, but at least it gives you a better path to getting it read, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I'm curious. Hey, Joel, Ocean, how did either of you get published?
Tried self-pub without doing that much marketing. I bought a pre-made book cover for $30 off off some site and through one of my NaNoWriMo projects up on Amazon and sold a couple copies to a few friends of mine. And I tried running a Kickstarter for a more professional cover. That failed. So I went on the Furry Writers Guild and started talking to other writers, and so I saw that Thurston Howell was looking for novella length submissions and asked if he'd be up for or publishing something I'd tried to self-pub before. Yeah. Of course, I'm pretty sure I'm not the only self-pubbed to indie pub author that THP has done that. No, that Gray Aid's first Conti Cycle book was originally he posted on his website.
Oh wow, really?
Yeah.
So I think it's time that we could ask questions in the chat. Does anyone have any questions for me, for Kirisa, Kyle, Ocean, or Czar Pollock? Are those how I pronounce it correctly?
Kiri's fine.
Yeah, you could call me Joel or Sarp.
Oh yeah, and Ocean still had his origin story to tell us.
Oh yeah, Ocean. Do you have any? What was your story?
For myself, I always did writing off and on as a hobby as a kid. I had joined a couple writing groups here and there. When I finally moved to where I am now, I met a group of writers that some people may be familiar with, like Tarl Hutch and Roland Ferret and them. And they were like, "Oh, you like writing?" I'm like, "Yeah, I like writing." So we would hang out, and I'd be like, "What are you guys doing?" And they're like, "Oh, we're gonna write these stories and submit them for publication." And I was like, "You can do that? People do that? You can just write a story? I thought you had to write like this huge long novel and go through a process." They're like, "Oh no, we're a lot of what we've done has been writing like short stories for anthologies, and like, look, I'm writing this one for pulp." And I was like, "Pulp? I love pulp. I love that genre. So like, if I could write a story for this." They're like, "Yep." And so I did, and I wouldn't recommend reading it because I've come a long way since then. But yeah, I wrote a story, and Yanis took it, and it started from there. It also surprised my parents because they were like, "You got published, but you did terrible at English in high school." And I'm like, "No, I did average in English in high school. I did fantastic when I got to university," because they would like to actually ask you what your thoughts and opinions were rather than just saying, "No, it's our opinion, you're wrong."
Yeah, I've noticed that when it came to I've noticed that lately when it comes to university English classes versus regular school classes. They don't go much for creativity.
Mm. Yeah, that might explain why I wasn't interested in creative writing in high school.
Yeah, me neither. At least not until I was a senior. So anyway, does anyone else have any other questions for us? Anyone in the chat have any questions to ask any of us here?
I have one for all of us. I know we talked about preparing yourself for rejection, but and I know all of us have been rejected at some point in time. But when you guys are rejected, what do you do? Like, what do you do to kind of decompress and pick yourself back up and keep writing?
I usually either distracted myself with a bit of TV or a good book, or I find the resolve to get to one of my current projects and just keep going at it.
I worked on one of my current. I've worked on a different project and maybe toss the rejected story up on Furry. See that. Right.
After swearing profusely and grumbling about how the editor/publisher know nothing about how good my writing is for many hours, I then stop, leave it for a couple days, come back to it, and then maybe look and see what could actually be improved on it. It sometimes goes in the drawer. Sometimes it gets resubmitted somewhere else.
Yeah, I usually get angry at the universe for a short period of time, and then I go remind myself that I've taken stories that were rejected elsewhere and gotten them published, and some of them have won awards after that. So I say it just hasn't found the right home yet, and it might not for many years. But usually, as Zarp was saying, I go work on a different project and go like, well, that one didn't get published, but I'll put it off until there's a place for it, and in the meantime, I have other stuff to do. I always have projects to work on and deadlines to meet.
I'd like to add on that when I do reject a story as an editor, I'm always happy whenever I find it found another place.
Yeah, that is a really nice sight there, knowing that it found a home.
That's true for most stories, but I've had a couple stories submitted where and this was a long time ago. This was not anyone who submitted to any of the anthologies I edited last year. I just want to make that clear because some of them are listening. But there have been stories from way back in the day where I was like, this should never be published.
Okay, that's true too.
On what level are you talking about there, Kyle? Like, is it's too grammatically bad, never be published, or the plot is too bad published?
In general, it was basically like, this is not a story. I'm being semi facetious about this because there's a place for everything, right? If you're like, I don't know why you submitted this to my PG rated furry anthology when it's an X rated non-furry fetish scenario that doesn't even have a plot or character arc. But there's a place for those things, right? There's websites where you post your non-furry kink scenarios, and it's fine, and then people expect to go there. But yeah, there were a couple stories that we got early on where one was just like a whole bunch of torture porn, and I don't mean like erotica that involved torture. I mean just like torture for the sake of torture, through a couple thousand words of a story, and I was like, I would not be unhappy if nobody else ever had to read this.
If anyone has a chance and has not done so, I highly encourage working on a slush pile because it will teach you a lot. It will tell you how far you still need to go because you'll see all these great works. At the same time, you will see many works where you're like, oh my goodness, I'm doing much better than I thought I was.
Yes.
Oh yeah, deep ditto for that one. Like I thought I was a semi-okay editor or writer before I started slush piling with diabolical plots. And boy, some of the stories they got, it's like, wow, may I someday write that well. And then there were others that were just like, yeah, this should have stayed in the drafts, friend.
So we have a couple questions in the chat. Any tips on query letters? I can definitely think of a few. We've covered them before. We covered how you need to follow some of the requirements and guidelines for publishing companies, and that especially involves what you include in a query letter. My best advice is practice makes perfect, and definitely do your research in what the body of a query letter is and what kind of company you're sending it to.
Hmm.
I think like the query letter, as Kiri was talking about the elevator pitch earlier, and the query letter should definitely include that. Like you usually you want to hook the agent or editor in the query letter so that they want to read more of your book. So if you can tell them, like, my story is about a boy who discovers that he's a wizard and his parents were murdered by an evil wizard, and now he has to learn how to be a wizard, except without using the word wizard so much. But like, make it interesting, make it gripping, and pull them in. And then again, people want different things in different query letters. Most agents will have a thing on their website that says, in your query letter, give us a paragraph synopsis of your story and the genre that it's in, and then list things. And some agents don't want the paragraph synopsis, and but as you know, there's lots of resources on the web about writing a good query letter. But basically, make your book sound so interesting that the person is going to have to pick it up and read it after they get the query letter.
Yeah, I can't think of any. Yeah, that's definitely a great explanation. I can't think of anything else to add to that. Anyone else?
Follow instructions. Again, if you're going to send a query to a publisher, double check how that publisher likes to get queries.
Mm-hmm. Are there any trends or theme cycles in terms of what the audience for furry writing seems to be interested in?
I can kind of glean some information on this because I kind of poke around with gold publications sometimes. One thing I do know that Sean was like really, really looking for was like stuff with like pirates. What else? Strong, sensible female characters. Definitely need a lot more of those as far as like novels go. Lots more fantasy, good sci-fi, noir. Noir is always welcome and fun to read. What else do people ask us? Pirates. Yeah, some pulpy ones too, like lots of adventure and actiony stuff. Those are definitely must-haves. This is kind of like my wish too. I'm always up for a good fantasy adventure or something with mythology in it.
I love a good romance that has a twist to it, not just a regular romance where the main characters are furry and that's the only appeal to it. Definitely give us a romance that has imagination or something different about it.
This is also something that, like, when we're allowed to go be in groups again, you can ask publishers or ask them in the Furry Writers Guild if they pop into the chats and stuff. Just say, hey, what kind of stories are you looking for? Or what kind of things do you think are selling? Because it'll change from time to time. But publishers are usually happy to talk about that, because if something is popular, then they want more of it. And writers asking what's popular because I want to send you things is a good question for a publisher to answer.
As annoying as it may sound to say, a good story. I wouldn't worry too much about the genre and trying to hit a target audience as much as just making sure that you're writing the story you want to and making it as great as possible. If it's a great story, it'll find readers.
Yeah, and furry, we're a little bit lucky in the furry fandom because mostly what furries are looking for is more furry stories. We might get fatigued at some point, but just for the area that I'm most familiar with, there have been, not as much now, but maybe 4 or 5 years ago, people were saying like, oh, there's so much gay romance in the furry fandom. There's so many gay romance stories, like but in whatever it was, 2004, 2005, when we published Vol and that series, there weren't that many, and in fact there were hardly any at all. So trends do kind of come and go, but really furries are looking for furry stories, and so if you write, as Ocean said, a good story that has furry characters in it, that's what we want.
Here's another question. If one posts a short story online and decides to convert it into a larger format or novel-length story, what would that complicate? Would that complicate a submission to a publisher since it was posted online in another format? Sometimes yes, and sometimes no. Like I said, my own book started off as like a series of short stories, and they were posted online, and I took those down, but left a couple up as like previews to interest people who might want to look at it more.
I don't personally know any furry publisher who would turn down a good story that they wanted to publish because part of it had been previously posted online.
Heck, I know a few other writers out there who have their original posts online, yet still have their book have their novel versions out there to buy. Sometimes with more access to and added scenes than are seen in the original versions.
Oh, wasn't there a story, Kyle, that you had posted online that I think Fuzz had asked, "Hey, can we put it in this book?"
Quite possibly.
I remember that being a story a long time ago where they're like, "I need another story," and they read one of your old stories, and they were like, "Hey, Kyle, can I just put this? Like, can I publish this?"
Oh yeah, wasn't it Waterway?
Tyrion asked about it. It was a like Victorian era thing that I'd written for some reason or another, and I can't remember what. It was like I had an idea. I think it was going to be the start of a universe that I was going to write more stories in, and then I never did, and so I just put that first one out there, and then Tyrion was like, "Hey, this fits the theme of our anthology. Can we reprint?" I've also had editors ask to reprint stories that I had published in con books, for what that's worth.
What is everyone's thoughts on audiobooks? I love them, and especially how we're slowly starting to get more audiobooks out there for furry fiction. I assume everyone's heard of Voice of Dog.
Yes. He's read one of my stories.
Same here.
And I've got a podcast where I read some of my some of my own stories, and I've started paying my younger brother, who's a stage actor, to reread some of them.
So we have about 5 minutes left. Does anyone else have any other questions in the chat? Awkward silence.
I guess probably we should take this time, since it's the last 5 minutes, to promote ourselves or whatever, tell people what we're working on or where they can find us at.
All right, definitely. You can find me on SoFurry for Affinity and DeviantArt, but I also have a Patreon called Domus Voces, writes furry fiction and short stories, and I write dystopian, gay romance, and science fiction fantasy stories. and I can be found on Telegram on Domus Voces. But yeah, if you have any questions or have any thing you want to ask, definitely hit me up. What about everyone else?
Carrie, go ahead, since you proposed this.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh boy. Well, what if I don't want to be found?
Oh, promote yourself.
All right. You guys can usually find me doling about on Swirly Tales on Twitter. I usually am poking around on there. You can find me at Crisis on Telegram if you have something that's really bugging you and you want to ask me about. My latest project is from Gold Publications. It's selections of anthropomorphic regalements, because we like the flair over at Gold Publications. And it's a collection of myths and fairy tales with a furry twist to them. So yeah, come check us out. Oh yeah, that and the Unbreakable TTRPG anthology. I was one of the editors on that. It's great. It's a wonderful tale. It's a wonderful look at D&D and the Asian diaspora. If you're looking for something different in D&D, please go check it out.
What about you, Kyle, or Ocean, or Star Poet?
Sure, you can find me online under my name, Kyle Gold. If you type Kyell into Google, probably most of the search results you'll get back are me. And I'm Kyle Gold on Twitter, which is where I usually talk about things that are upcoming or just released or about to happen or have just happened. I have a newsletter which is linked in my Twitter bio. I think it's bit.ly/KyleMail, where once a month I send out a newsletter saying, here's the projects that I'm working on, and I will talk about them more freely in the newsletter than I do in other places, because I trust those people. SoFolf.com, BadDogBooks.com has all of my ebooks. We talked about audiobooks. I have a dozen or so audiobooks that are on Audible and iTunes. And you can pretty much find my stuff anywhere you want to buy books by typing my name into the search bar.
I guess you can find me on Twitter, as someone just added me on Twitter. So that's working. You can either go at Ocean Tigrox for my normal account, or Tigrox Tales, TLLES, for my Reddit account. That's kind of a little full of cobwebs these days because it's been a busy life this year. But I'm in various anthologies. Go check out Inhuman X if you want to read my editing. I've also done the second Guild anthology. And if you're wondering about Inhuman X 2, I apologize. You can come hunt me down later.
Okay. I can't wait to read Inhuman X 2 either, so. What about you, Joel?
You can find me as Zarpaulus on Twitter and FA and so Furry. I'm on Amazon. I've got a few books on Amazon as Joel Kreisman, and I've got stories in a couple of Thurston Hell's Divine Clomedy anthologies.
All right. I want to thank all of you for joining me on this. I felt like it was more than a one-person panel, and I'm really glad that you gave your 2 cents on how to get yourself published and to help other writers get their works out there.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, totally.
No, thank you for coming. Anything else to add before we go?
Drink mead, save doles.
Uh-huh. Don't drink and drive.
Go out and write. Have a good weekend.
Definitely. Everyone have a good week ahead of you.